Okay, Carl, this is a discussion that is long time coming, I would say. We've talked about this offline a lot, and I don't think I think people have skipped over a lot of this, and I think this is the problem. They're just going straight, this happens a lot. They go straight to the technology or they go straight to the exercise, and there's not a lot of contextual discussion where we can fill in blanks and really understand why we're doing what we're doing. So in this case, I titled this sort of resisted and assisted sprint methods, an in-depth discussion. And if you're old school like you and me, we're getting very close to requiring Social Security. Um, we have done old school training. Like, okay, what are we gonna do? We got sprint practice. Okay, we're gonna do what are you gonna use? Maybe you starting blocks, maybe you run up a hill, maybe you're at the track, you're on the field, whatever. Maybe you have a med ball. So that was it. It was very it wasn't equipment intensive. It never had to be. Run to that tree or run to that cone. But now, everything is very equipment intensive, and it makes it interesting for sure. As a coach, you're like, okay, what do I have to bring to the track now, right? And what does the athlete expect? What does the client expect? And maybe you see these same things in physical therapy, but I think we want to get into this whole idea of like, why are we doing this? Why are we why are we pulling people? Why are we pushing people? Why are we,
Yeah.
making them move heavy weights when we have a weight room for that? So I think we started with here, are these methods working? If so, how? Like what's going on? Why are we doing this? Is it actually making people faster? Do you have some initial thoughts?
Well, that's a lot to unload because as soon as you started talking about training, you probably first think about your own personal experiences. And I remember like the shed was empty when I was in high school, right? You're lucky to get you bring your own shoes and um,
There were always broken hurdles, right?
broken hurdles. So it's just if the equipment was not the equipment used in track practice. You probably like I remember when medicine balls became like kind of a business commodity where you could sell them rather than being some sort of weird hey the medicine balls were found there, no one knew where they came from, there wasn't really a true commerce for that, even though that they've been around for hundreds of years. So I think the most obvious question is, are these methods working? And then compared to what? So when I start looking at, let's just go with resisted sprinting. If you didn't have to do any resisted sprinting, you didn't believe in it, and there are some amazing coaches that have had produced gold medalists that for some reason philosophically they had amazing accelerators, but they never used sleds at all. Okay, so that what does that say? That's an extreme point, and they're able to achieve great acceleration. Then there's some people that have obsessed with acceleration. They have all the equipment for resisted acceleration, and they're not doing anything interesting. So for me, interesting is what is the world record for 10 meters? Now, there's going to be a lot of arguments there, but I just don't see a lot of 1.67s in the first 10 in track and field, which craves acceleration, that needs it. So if we're not seeing it there, where are we seeing it in pro sports? Now we're seeing better performances, but are they actually better accelerations? I don't see that. It's not to say that we're not getting the majority of people to run faster and accelerate better, but the ceiling hasn't been very interesting for rate of acceleration.
Yeah, like I go back to this, the talk in the old days about boxers and boxing, and like, oh, you don't want to lift weights because it'll make you slower, and we just, hit the fast bag, and we punch the bag, and we hit mitts and all that, and that was a speed thing, right? Like we
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
want to slow people down, and whether or not that's absolutely true, and I guess a lot more MMA and boxers are doing conventional weightlifting now, but they're not giving up on the mitts and the fast bags and the speed stuff, right? So is that the same in track and field? Have we gone to this place where if we don't do sled work or resisted work, our legs are going to fall off, right? Like I think there is a bit of an insecurity now that this is, and it's part of the educational the evolution is like this is what you do for acceleration, right? And then you see the picture of the guy, with the sled or the whatever attached to him, the tire, and so everybody just falls in and goes like, okay, yeah, that's acceleration work. And I've been to um, training sessions where they say, yeah, we're going to focus on acceleration today. Well, let's break out all the sleds. Let's push the sled. Let's drag the sled. Let's, use the bands and use the resistance. And honestly, I do that to some degree too. I try to be careful with it, but it just seems like from a definition point of view of acceleration work, is this what people just default to now?
Yeah, I think that's the easiest because it's visible. Let's say sled bands existed, you weren't really able to do that. It's harder to show a periodized program over 2.5 years of someone improving the ability to conquer inertia by using the weight room, right? So what became a problem, which is the weight room is this, magical place, sort of like alchemy. You get gold from the lead that you have inside the weight room. The opposite has happened, where we forgot about the weight room. Where, hey, what can we get from just the weight room and just sprinting naked without equipment? I think the courage to be able to show up to a practice without a lot of equipment, no tripod, no timing systems, not even a stopwatch, and have a good plan, analog style, pen and paper, that's a scary endeavor for the average coach, right? So I think that's something to think about is what can you get from repetition rather than load? And I think that's where my biggest concern is that we failed to address the most simple of principles because is the user experience and expectations of the athlete, uh, what do they crave? Do they think that equipment and technology is necessary, or is it an insecurity thing by the coach, or a combination of the two?
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's a lot to all of this here. And I think what I want to get into is like historical perspective. So what did we start with? And how do we get to this place? So let's start with hill runs. And this is an interesting one. Because when I was an athlete, if somebody said we're going to go run hills, what did you think of? What did you think that was going to look like?
Usually, the hills were long enough where there was a fatigue component, and it was an achievement, right?
Yes.
I can refer to a couple hills that I looked at, and you kind of did that for this kind of uh, cultural component, almost like you're doing some sort of offering to the gods of sport, where if you give a pound of flesh, you're going to be better down at the end of the year. So hills usually were more of conditioning, and you do them to kind of build up some sort of quote stamina. I've been blessed. There's a really small, not aggressive, but it's almost like the most perfect set of hills is right next to the track. And it's great because a whole bunch of groups can do it. It's not in the middle of a field because it's a hill. No, it's not, you're not using someone else's turf. And for me, I love that because there's just enough inclination that you can get some work done, but you felt quick. You didn't feel like your legs were dead. So it was like a sweet spot. So hills to me, I love them, but the question is, are they dying because they are seen as antiquated? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, again, I'm going to say the same thing. Like if somebody said we're going to go do hills, it was equated with a general preparatory phase, and it was like, hey, we're going to get some work done here. And these hills could be anywhere between 80 to 300 meters in length, which was again daunting. I still have nightmares about some of the hills we ran. Um, And then I was in UCLA like decades ago, and I was doing a visit, and I met Jim Bush. Remember that name?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Right. So I guess he trained Quincy Watts and a bunch of others. I think he even trained John Smith for a period. Anyways, so he was talking about these great hills that they do behind at UCLA, behind up above Drake Stadium, right? Where I guess it was just this long 300-meter hill that they could do, and how that he periodized it so they would start with a few hills and then they would add a hill every week and blah, blah, blah. And it was like this would make them strong and this would get them ready to run the 400 or, whatever sprint. And that kind of stuck with me. I still have that workout. I got a copy of it, right, that he had typed out. Um, but that was my perception of what hills were used. And I don't really understand where it flipped. Where did it flip where hills or resisted work now was for early acceleration? Like it was is very interesting. But definitely hill work was always equated with, grinding it out. And I think the only other thing that I saw as part of that is if you're at a track stadium, like there's stadium stairs. That
yeah.
was another one, right? Which again, was it a speed thing? No, it was like a strength, general fitness activity, right? Earlier in the season, nobody's running stairs, as to prepare for a meet that week. Um, and then the final thing was I was coaching this kid back in 2000, and we focused on qualitative acceleration work, speed, relaxation. And he would tell me stories about his previous coach who would get a big tire, put a rope around it, put it around their waist, and he would throw shot puts into the tire and have them drag it around the field a couple of times. I was just like, okay. So those were my historical perspectives on resisted training. And then there's a couple other weird ones like people would go and sprint on the sand and the beach for like, long periods of time. And but none of those to me rang of like, hey, speed, like fast, running really fast over any distance for that matter. So that's that's very interesting that this is a recent phenomenon. Like, and if we say recent, I would say the last what, 2 decades at most.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of the things is like for example on the stadium stairs you could see HSI when they're doing like a kind of like a walking lunges
Yep, I
up the
remember those.
stairs from that video. And then with hill training, like one of the things that, I'm a huge 49er fan because of Jerry Rice, and he had the infamous hill,
Yep.
and that was minutes. It wasn't like, he was trying to get the first 5 yards. He was trying to get like some sort of like it was one rep, it was like, can you do the hill? And so that was a conditioning run, and that was done in the off season, as well as some of the stuff that he was doing sprinting wise. So I think that's from a historical perspectives is to say, okay, yeah, there might have been a lot of junk training, maybe some mistakes in the past. Okay, but we're going to have some amnesty to that by allowing us to say, what can we glean from that that we might be missing now? So, like work capacity. If I say do a double session, people think that's weird, right? Like, oh, he's doing a double in the off season, and that's because it's easier to split up a longer session by either taking a break and maybe for a lunch. So some of these things are getting chopped off, and you're throwing the baby, with the bathwater a bit. So
Did you ever read the Track and Field Quarterly Review Journal?
yeah, that was yeah.
Yeah, I would go to the library and I'd photocopy those. And there was an article. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Remember
yeah,
that? I would have
yeah.
to like,
The suffering of the Xerox machine. Yeah.
yeah. I'm like, you would fill the card that would allow you, and you're like, oh shit, I ran out of credits for my copies, or the copies were coming out way too like overexposed, and I was just like, fuck. It was. Those are the thrills that I miss, obviously. Um, but there
We
was
had
an article.
quarters. I
Yeah,
don't know
yeah.
what's up in socialized world of Canada.
It
We
was
had
10 cents per copy.
okay, okay. So
Yeah,
we
yeah.
was it change operated?
Oh, if you use change, it was 10 cents per copy, I think.
Okay,
But if you got there's like a card, a
Oh
credit
yeah.
card or whatever, it would come down to seven if you bought like a $20 card, seven
Okay.
cents a copy.
This is
Anyways,
remind me of my horrors of going to Staples. No, it was Kinko's. It was Kinko's in the late 90s when you had to find like Xeroxing was just like,
oh yeah.
yeah, you had to, pay a lot to, because that's the only way to get some of the information. It's like you couldn't even do interlibrary loan.
Yeah, that's the furthest away from AI that we could
Yeah.
have gotten.
Yeah.
So there was an article I read. It was a John Smith article, and I have it somewhere. But he was talking about like early on in the season, I distinctly remember him saying we do not need to accelerate in early in the season. So they did focus on very general qualities. And I didn't necessarily do that as a coach. I did do some degree of submaximal acceleration, but that always stuck with me is like, he had some pretty fast runners there and pretty good starters too, to some degree. And he never thought that he had to overemphasize acceleration, especially early. So it's interesting how far we've come, and have we gotten too far away from that? And is it a specificity thing that's driving this?
I think it's specificity where, you know, I call it the silent specificity where, if someone has a bungee cord and you attach it, to your ankle and you start doing soccer kicks. Oh, that's silly. That's funny. People are, pointing fingers at it. Yet from a specificity from a program design issue, what happened to GPP? So that's why I think we have a silent epidemic of specificity, which is longer seasons in the absence of GPP. So I do think that there's something there that, while we might not be making the obvious mistakes with specificity traps, I think
Hmm.
that we're still we still have some baggage from those days. It just is not as obvious.
Yeah. Yeah, no. I think the next area I want to take this discussion is okay, so say we're entering sort of the pre-modernist
Yeah,
era and we're starting to see more resistance devices and
yeah.
resistance techniques. So I have a list here. And I think one of the things that I noticed when I was training in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s is for some reason parachutes started appearing. Um, and that I don't know if people still use them, but it was
They do. They
they
do.
do? Oh,
Yeah.
anyways.
It's
Uh,
crazy now.
uh,
It's so like for example, look at ice hockey. Looking on video right now, and I'm seeing a NHL team using parachutes. I'm like, okay. Now, but the question is like, is it because there's some nuances within a parachute that might cause some unique changes or opportunities to ice hockey? I don't know. I think parachutes are really huge. I remember it was like Joey Galloway. He was doing parachutes in Ohio State, and it just looked cool. It's like, wow, like it's like, he's like a funny car, or getting huge amounts of acceleration, and then you're like, wow, he needs a parachute. He's sprinting that fast. So I think parachutes are kind of like an endangered species. I would not go and take large amounts of venture capital to get into big parachute, but they still exist. Sometimes, and then what happens is, the people that remember parachutes look at them fondly, and then what happens is you remember what you did, or you say, well, let's just try it again. Like suddenly, parachutes are going to be much different this time around. Yeah.
I
So
remember I was at a continuing education retreat with some guys, and Doug Kashigian was there, and he had an actual parachute, like because he
yeah,
was in the military,
yeah.
and they were trying to like run with it, and it would like toss them all over the place. And anyways,
Yeah.
um, yeah, no, I hopefully they don't make a comeback, but it's interesting. And there was another reference that Rob Panarello gave me. He said he was at some conference or something, and a bunch of medical doctors and surgeons were there, and somebody said, "Well, do you have any peer-reviewed studies to prove what you're saying?" He says, "Well, there aren't any peer-reviewed studies on parachutes, but if I got to jump out of a plane, I'm going to use one, right?" So yeah, that's the only place where it seems to work. Okay, so the other thing that I got involved with in the early 90s was I had an Eastern Bloc coach, and he had this pulley system that he had made himself. So it was like a pulley system where somebody pulls somebody for overspeed.
Yeah.
And at the time I was doing triple jump. Bad idea. Bad idea to do overspeed to take off from a triple jump board and feel like your kneecaps are going to blow off on the first
Oh
landing.
God.
Um, so that was another one, and there was a whole sort of an array of pulley systems that came out, I guess in the 90s. So do you have any experience with those?
Yeah, so like so you talked about the assisted pulley system or the resisted ones.
Yeah.
So there's an array of like kind of like you know uh, when you're towing two people or sort of like tug of war. That was one thing. So anything with a harness, and then there's usually some sort of contraption. Uh, Elastic. I mean, that's before the wraps or the encasings that they'd have, because when those snapped, um, bad news. So that's the other thing is for swimming and track. I remember the rubber bands, and you have that after a couple of years, you see that kind of like rusty look in that elastic. You kind of have that dread as an athlete. You're like, wow, someone's gonna get burnt. So I remember that. And then on the overspeed, keep in mind a pulley, the actual, the engineering component, not the whole system, but the actual pulley itself, is currently used with these very advanced systems. So they
Yes.
call it gear one and gear two. Basically, you're getting a pulley, and then they're just doubling the resistance from it. So a lot of times people don't realize, okay, yeah, the technology that we had in the 80s and the 90s became, uh, in, you know, essential for today to make some of these more advanced systems to become, even though they're very expensive, at least somewhat affordable. And also, it's the way that you use them. So there's a lot of things that you did. So yeah, you'd run with it and you give someone assistance, but then there's expectations of what they do in terms of the run up, how they should feel. There's some great coaching that was going on to some really primitive equipment. And then what happened is as the technology got better, I've been seeing more dependence on the technology. So the opposite became true, which is the coaching got diluted as the technology got better.
Yes. Yes. No, and there wasn't really any quantification of any of this stuff right at that time. Like how fast, how much, it was just
Well,
kind
if
of
you're
like,
if you're a coach, you're running to try to help the athlete. You can't just hold on to the stopwatch.
yeah,
So there's a
yeah.
lot of mechanics of coaching that prevented even like when you coach, you've got to get your hands dirty literally by holding something or like for example, there's a lot of times where a coach is holding an athlete down or a piece of equipment down so that it doesn't like you're just a lot of it is just really raw and gutsy, you know. Yeah.
There was a great story that Charlie Francis told me about a coach who was testing these overspeed methods, and he
Yeah.
would have his wife, kind of use the car to kind of pull him along, but he hadn't realized that his wife found out about the affair that he was having, and she
Oh, God.
he was pushing the throttle a little bit faster than he could handle.
Ooh.
Anyways, sleds. When
Yeah.
did you first start seeing sleds make an appearance as part of a sprint program?
In high school, the first thing is the sleds, you had one or two, and the seniors got to use it, and the seniors that were fast were using it. So I didn't see like for me, it's like I wasn't, track and field was something I participated. I did not excel. Um, and so my whole thought was, I'll be ready for the sleds, right?
You're
And you
sled
see,
worthy?
yeah, you're sled worthy because again, all equipment. you have 60 to 70, kids that are there. You can't get, when you're a high school program, there's a lot of budgeting for things that have nothing to do with training, like, like for example, uniforms or the buses. One thing I did notice that I really didn't like about the sleds, and this is a scientific component, is the harnesses. The harnesses were gross because what happens is usually they had some sort of material that was, you know, that would get sweat, and so it'd be like March 1st, for spring track, and you open up the closet, and there's like a musk scent, and you're like, oh, and then you're putting it on, and you realize that it's been used by hundreds of guys that are just gross and sweaty. But one thing that's really interesting that I think that people forget is you might have something new and high tech, but they're not even looking at the research to the value of how you mount on either the pelvis, and you see a lot of people still using shoulder harnesses. And it's like, hey, it's uncomfortable, it's chafing, and the research shows you probably want to use a conventional belt.
Yeah, good point. Good point. They're, and it's funny, like I'll still look up like sleds, and apparently Amazon sells everything, and they will always come with an upper body harness, almost sometimes without the waist belt.
Yeah.
So I don't know where that comes from, or if it because it's more difficult, because you can't rotate and there's a restriction, maybe they think that's good. I have no idea, but
What usually happens is montages. What is killing training is YouTube with millions of views of Rocky 4. What do you see? What do you see in there? You see, which is interesting, you're seeing an inclined treadmill with Drago, and you're seeing all of the weird exercises like external rotation with all of these lights and stuff. But you also see Rocky struggling, like Call of the Wild, trying with a harness to move. I don't know. It's just it's the I forget the older guy that's just sort of there as a hanger on, but he's trying to pull the sled. And there's a bunch of people in it, and it's like they see this as like I'm not sure what he was trying to do in boxing for acceleration, but it's like Call of the Wild. You're trying to get a sled dog, and that's what they have harnessed. With a dog, you don't put it around the waist, you put it around where their neck is. So I think a lot of times people look and say, okay, human sled, let's Google images, sled training, and they see like an Alaskan race, and oh, okay, we got to put it around the shoulders. Let's put it, and then that's their design. And this is
it's all Sylvester Stallone's fault.
well, yeah, the Tulsa King or whatever. Yeah, I guess
Uh,
so. I mean, but again, when you look at the 80s and 90s, the montages halfway through the movie, which is great. I always love them. Is the hero, something happens at the beginning, they get defeated, and guess what? GPP. So then they have to go through the training montage so you can buy into the very end fight or some sort of like end of the movie. So I think that's where a lot of this stuff comes from is this Hollywood.
yeah. Well, the unfortunate metaphor is that Sylvester Stallone typically won the fights by taking a serious beating and letting the other guy tire himself out as he beat his face up, and then he came back. So
Yeah,
maybe that's not a good thing for training. But
right.
anyways, um, let's go back to the sleds because I think when
Yeah.
I started seeing sleds, Charlie France was like, make sure that you do not load it up so that you go beyond a 10% loss in speed or a 10% change in your best time, right? He was always about like best time because he was always using a stopwatch. Did
Yeah.
you think that was just a common sense recommendation? Like, hey, let's make sure it doesn't get too far away from what we're trying to do here, which is run fast. 10% is an acceptable decrement, but it's not really based on anything else but a judgment call. What do you think?
Yeah, obviously, the 10% rule was floating around the space for a reason. And it's usually a governor to say, hey, let's remember to keep things sane and safe and make sure that the main thing is the main thing. So with sleds, it still resisted sprinting. There's a point where if it gets slow enough, you're not accelerating. It's the same static posture, and you're not teaching how to accelerate. You're just doing specific strength. So I think with the sleds is the eyeball test is the, hey, is he accelerating? He or she accelerating during the repetition? Does it look like sprinting? Does the movement patterns look like it? And I think that it has 10% speed. Some people say, okay, 10% body mass. There's been a lot of theories to it, but the main thing is, does it look good? Does it look fast? And what happens is everyone looks good slow. So when you're pushing a heavy sled and you're just doing it, rep after rep, everyone can do that. It's socialized speed. Everyone looks good, but no one gets really that much better.
I'm really hurting from the socialized comments here in this
Oh,
discussion.
listen, I'm a huge fan of Canada, but it's just the because we're border brothers, it allows us to have that inside joke,
It's okay. I got thick skin here. It's cold up here. Okay, so parachute sleds, pulley systems, and then there's been some other sort of recommendations around assisted over speed. Like I remember I was talking with Al Vermeil, and he was said he always had his athletes on the football field. Some of them are AstroTurf crown fields, and he would have them run down, the slope of the crown field. And we've seen other sort of manifestations of that. And then the other one was running with the wind. If you had a heavy wind, let's run with the wind. And then
Yeah.
you saw the Italian sprinter running behind the Pope Mobile or whatever that was to get the wind resistance out of the way. So what are your thoughts on these sort of subtle manifestations of assisted or whatever you want to call it
Yeah,
overspeed?
yeah. I mean, the crown fields, you've seen this happen where there's like it might be designed for practical purposes like water runoff, crowned obviously in football. Um, I love those. The issue is accessibility, and when do you get access to them? Because if it's a great field, you see the security. It's like they're waiting for this poor soul to get on the field, finally get a good warm up, and they, you talk about Pope Mobile. There's the golf cart that comes down there to enforce, hey, get off, get off my lawn, that type of thing. So I do see that. There's the 1% grade. You're lucky if you had it. There's like one out of 200 tracks would have that the decline by 1%. It's usually one coach fights for it, they get it built, and then it doesn't get used as much, and then people forget about it. Or, one of the other problems with it is that you have to, with any type of decline, you got to make sure that there's a runoff that's not going to cause problems. Wetlands protection, and then you're going to have to, then you're getting in trouble because there's a bylaw. It's a lot of complicated things when you're building that stuff. And then with the infamous wind machine, I've seen that. It's crazy. It's also designed so that if you were to pull it, you can go and do like a 300. So it's
Yeah.
crazy. If you with the curve, if you're running with it, it's like doing a overspeed rep for like 30 seconds. It's crazy.
Hmm.
The amount of metabolic disturbances that you're getting from that is inhuman. So those are all nice to have. It's like you talk about it, but they're not really accessible. You can't rely on those things because that machine in Italy, what am I going to do? A training camp in Italy just for that? So that's not, and then even if you wanted to go to Italy for that, is the weather cooperative and are you prepared to do it? A lot of times GPP or SPP phases in the spring, it's a lot of this overspeed stuff is great during later in the season. So there's a little bit of a timing issue with all of it.
I always find that some of this weird, interesting stuff always comes from Italy. Like, is it just part of the culture? Is it just the philosophy or of that they've kind of had over the last, 3,000 years. But yeah, it's like, oh, where did that come from? Oh, it's Italy.
It's
Um,
surprising.
yeah,
With Italy, there's I was Roberto Bonami. Like this guy is, he's an engineer and a track coach. And so it's like the amount of resources he's putting into his addiction, which is track, was obscene. I mean, I saw him in Scandinavia buying an overspeed device like 20 years ago, right? And he's a lot of the Italians have some great history of sports technology and training equipment.
yeah.
So you got to credit to them. They find a way to make it happen.
Now, before we jump into kind of what's more modern with some of these assistance and
Yeah,
resistance, the other thing was there was a period there, and I think it still might exist on some level, where there's motorized treadmills for overspeed. I think the one company, it was Frappier or whatever,
yeah, yeah,
the,
yeah,
the
yeah.
the high-speed treadmills. What are your thoughts on those? They seem to have come and gone. I don't know. There's variations now where there's people doing incline treadmills and all that, but what about the treadmill? Have we made any advances there?
No, there's a little bit more there's more instrumentation to the treadmills, but there's not really a lot of conceptual advancements. Usually what you're having is cameras for feedback, and maybe you might have some force sensors, but not much. I remember those days, late 90s, and you saw, and it was the middle of nowhere. It was like it wasn't like it was done in like uh, large cities. I think it was done like in like the Dakotas or something.
Hmm.
But I remember he presented on the inventor or the business. I was at the Tyler, Texas SAQ conference or whatever, and he presented on overspeed. I think it was Anthony Munoz, from the Bengals, who's sprinting on it. And he's an offensive lineman. I posted on social media about he told about how valuable it was for him to do a lot of running and sprinting as a lineman, and he's a Hall of Famer. Found it very interesting. He was very athletic. So the treadmill space, I think, is kind of like flatlined a little bit in terms of
Yeah,
like innovation, but it's still there, meaning it's just so valuable to have a good treadmill when you're doing like research or some investigations.
that's true. That the quantification piece
Yeah.
is important. Uh, Side note here, in 2003, I went to a John Mayer concert in a small venue in Vancouver, and there's this little kid in front of me, like just like going nuts and like in the line, and I'm like, who the hell is this kid? It's like, and it was at like a bar. It was like at a you had to be 19 and older, so I'm like, why is this kid here? It ended up being a Freddie Munoz or whatever, like Malcolm in the
Okay.
Middle.
Okay.
And so Malcolm in the Middle standing in front of me going, I can't wait to see John Mayer. Like, anyways, that's my Munoz reference. Anyways, so if we talk about where we've come from, more sort of crude ways of doing resistance and assistance, what has happened in the last, you say you have here early products like 2000, 2005, and then now we have a more refined approach or many more actors in the marketplace for programmed resistance or motorized resistance and assistance.
Yeah, or electric, because a
Yeah,
motor is one way to do it. And so while everyone's touting a Japanese Omron motor, do you have to use motors? And then the people freak out because, they're just repeating what they've read from the brochure. So I think a really important thing is to go way back to uh, Dr. Miros, those studies from Finland. Okay. So when you look at sort of like the some of the best innovations, it's coming from Norway, then to, and Sweden, and of course Finland. Those three countries, collaborate. And you'll see in a research study, 1980s, this is when you really start to see some good research on sprinting. Some of his book on Dr. Mira's book on sprinting is just it's perfect. It's like all you really need now. But what was interesting is they did some overspeed studies and they did some resistance sprinting, but they did overspeed, which I like because it's like, hey, can we get people faster rather than can we train with resistance? I think that was kind of like the cardinal direction I really liked. And so those machines were used, but they were custom made and they were more like towing on demand. And that was like the 80s, the machines. Then in the 90s, you'd have a side project or a side hustle for maybe a sports scientist or a really good coach to say, okay, I made this for myself. I know a lot of other coaches would like it. Maybe do a small business, like something on the side. But right around the early 2000s, that's when we started to see technology starting to evolve. This is post laptop, pre iPhone. And so you still had the Palm Pilots and the other small technologies that were, Apple Newton, if you remember that. Those type of things were part of the equation because usually when you use sports tech, you'd have some sort of like some sort of like trigger device or something to operate it, like a remote or something. But it started to evolve into machines that would maybe create the benefit or the adaptation or the stimulus, but it wasn't really measuring much. But you're really trying to dial up either assistance or resistance. Okay. And then maybe if you had a serial cable, right, you connect it to a computer. And if you had like a good indoor facility, you could facilitate that, right? But that's the problem is a lot of this technology wasn't really useful in the wild. It wasn't really durable or water resistant. So right around 2005 was interesting because if you look at currently the 1080 and then you have the 1080 Sprint, which has been around kind of technically for about 20 years,
Hmm.
right? If you look at when they really got into the market about 10 years ago, they didn't really have that many in America, right? So people have to understand how much resources it took to take it out of the the Scandinavia area. So just so you know that there was some collaborations, and I want to make sure that my history here is very accurate. One should probably do their due diligence on looking at the history of what was going on from 2000 to 2005 in terms of the inception of assistance. Now, swimming has done a better job than track and field on overspeed. Okay? Overspeed and resistance. They just do a better job. Okay? The issue is that they don't really have the commerce or the market outside of swimming. So what happens is a lot of the good technologies don't really make it into to help football and soccer and some other
Hmm.
sports like hoops. So anytime I see a piece of technology for uh, field sports, I know it came from track 10 years earlier, and it probably came from swimming 10 years earlier than that. And then, unfortunately, before that, usually, you know, military's been doing something for reasons that are not to try to get people better, but to help, kill off the enemy. So I think that's where people have to understand that the younger brother of war is sport, right? Sport has to learn from other areas to steal innovation because it's not a lot of resources. There's $1 trillion going into the military. I don't think there's $1 trillion going into motorized resistance and sprinting. So I think that's where you have to understand. Now, fast forward to today, okay? You still have the Muscle Lab or Ergo Test, and now you have the T Apex, and you're seeing a lot of motorized resistance and strength training. You got OxFit. You have another company's Beyond Power, and you have all of these motorized resistance products. Another company like One Rep has some sort of Rep One, I forget the name of the company, has another unit for resistance because the market for fitness is huge, right? Tonal, motorized resistance. But motorized sprinting isn't really popular because there's not a huge amount of people sprinting after age 30. So the market for sprinting is tiny because sprinting is just like the ability to run when you're older is hard. The ability to sprint when you're, you know, middle age is probably very sparse. So why I share that history. If you don't know your history, you're going to be buying stuff that's overinflated in terms of cost. Now, assisted sprinting with precision, making sure that the logic on how responsive it is and how the motor is working and the calculations, that's what you're paying for.
Hmm.
You're paying for algorithms. You're talking about aerospace parts because when you're getting towed, the athlete can feel how responsive it is. They want to feel like there's wind on demand, which is like, oh, I feel like I'm opening up. I feel safe and comfortable. You don't want to feel like, apparently that coach was cheating on his wife and is getting towed by the Honda Accord from 30 years ago. So I think that's where we're going to is now it was T Apex is very recent. If you notice it, it's very similar to the Sprint 2. The Sprint 2 is not much different than the Sprint 1. Yes, you have a touchscreen. Yes, it has batteries, but it's not really mobile. It's big, it's heavy. Uh, what do you see on the photos? You see weight plates to keep it down and to hold it down. You see that everywhere. And I'm like, we had all this time to develop a new product, and we're still using plates, even to mount it. So those are the leading three products. What we're going to see in 2026 is the new wave of equipment. A little bit smaller, a little bit far less expensive. So the price point from like that 20,000 is going down to 5,000. T Apex, while it's good, I do think that something's going to be in that price range. I predict three, and that's an easy prediction when you know what's going on. But you're going to see that these products are going to be better at 5,000. And you remember the first laptops when you'd have this huge case and it could barely do anything, but it was portable. You're going to see that with any technology. It's going to be smaller, it's going to be better, it's going to be more accurate, it's going to have more features, it's probably going to be a little bit more durable. So that's what we have in place for the future for both assisted and resisted sprinting.
Now, can I play a bit of a devil's advocate here? We have Scandinavian countries developing sprint resistance
Yeah,
assistance technology.
yeah.
How come we haven't seen improvements in their sprint programs for those countries? Like we haven't seen, you could argue, 400 hurdles for Norway, but that's not in the same realm. He got beat by a pole vaulter in the 100 meters. Um, you know what I'm saying? Like I'm just coming from
Yeah.
like
So
they've developed this technology. It's supposed to make you faster. Well, let's all run to IKEA and let's start sprinting. Why hasn't that manifested itself?
I think when it comes down to this, if you look at winter sports and summer sports, Winter Olympics is around the corner. You have to start thinking about just, the geography. Uh, I don't think, I'll be honest with you. Look at Massachusetts. Look at Rhode Island. When I was coaching in Florida, I had like a half a second to a second faster just because there's just something about being in warm weather, right? There's advantages. Chronologically, over time, it's compounding to be having access to better conditions. Now, to support that, remember the early 2000s during the heyday. If you look at the jumps, you had a gold medalist in the heptathlon, the triple jump, right?
High
You
jump.
start high jump with Stefan Holm. So they've always punched above their weight. Norway has not been as strong on track and field. And then with Finland, you see some good success. But take a look at the recent Olympics with the decathlon. You know, great athlete, very successful. They use the equipment to get better. And now, obviously, Some people might get injured, and you say, okay, who is the best one? But you still want a gold medal. Having an athlete win a medal uh, of any color is going to be an impressive feat, and that's highly speed rated. If you look at most of the events in track and field, except for the 1500, there's something to be said by having fast feet.
Yeah, I just find it interesting that Scandinavia is known for basically heart rate monitors and sprint resisted and assisted equipment, as in terms of performance. Like
Well,
that's
just so you know, Finland there's a mecca of information and knowledge about, look at where omega wave end up being, and then look at heart rate variability of all the great people over there in Finland. Finland's a mecca for sports science, and a lot of it is physiological. You look at polar stuff like that, and then with motorized resistance is it's basically the combination of Scandinavia, specifically Scandinavian countries with robotics. So if you look at the area, I think it's near the southern part of Sweden. There's an area where they do a lot of robotics works, and so that's where a lot of the technology came from. And then with Norway, specifically Ergotest, also known as Muscle Lab from a brand, they had this is where we go back to Italy. Look at their history. Look at their history in the late 80s and early 90s. Carmelo Bosco, remember the Bosco tests? Um, and going down to either Formia. Bosco was in Finland, and then his later years, before he passed, was in Italy. And so I think those historical components show how things have evolved. While it might be coming from uh, Scandinavia, look at some early pioneers in the 90s. Uh, I think his name is Elaine Belly. I'm butchering my French is horrific. I don't speak a lick of it, but he was involved with Carmelo Bosco. So we have to know what were we doing then, what was the technology, and how much better is the results in the training? Not much different.
yeah. So the next thing I want to kind of, finish the conversation is
Yeah.
like where are we going? And as part of that, where are we going sort of thought process, what is good about these innovations in your opinion? And then what is the dark side of some of these innovations where it may have unintended consequences?
Yeah, there's every rose has its thorn, and there's been a lot of suffering that's come from. So, you know, let's just talk about some of the banes of my existence. The user experience is becoming really just the athletes aren't they're not enjoying training. Back in the day, you'd get a boombox, play some music, and you'd get to work, right? But now a lot of that natural feeling of just either a group dynamic is being lost because all right, I got to put in my pin to log in to do this one rep of my VBT, and it's like athletes want to sometimes just train. That's why CrossFit became so popular, is because it just became more, more natural. Just kind of go in there and get the job done. So I think what I'm seeing is that we're seeing a kind of a split situation where people want to get a lot simpler and a lot more focus on the craft, and people are trying to get uh, half sports scientist, half game show host, where the training experience, you go in there, I'm like, I would hate to be an athlete now. That looks miserable. So I think that's where a lot of the companies in sports tech have kind of polluted that natural user experience where that workflow is clean. You get to get engaged into the activity versus all of this noise with tablets and biofeedback that just doesn't do anything. It became we overdosed on data and technology and too much science. At the end of the day, science is great to guide you, but you don't want to be a lab experiment. No one wants to feel like a lab rat. It just feels it just has a bad taste in your mouth with regards to can you enjoy the process or not.
So are we able to kind of do a bit of a throwback to old school methods as part of this? Like, do you think there's a fertile ground for introducing, non-specific training, less tech-oriented training, getting it becoming again, creating more of a social environment, a community, like you said, with the, kind of with the CrossFit, right? Like people seem to gravitate more towards like the bro science than the actual sports science. The feel of it.
Yeah, I think the people are craving that now, and uh, with inputs, you can get so much overload, doom scrolling. One of the biggest issues is that everyone has a like a AirPod in their ear, and like it used to be like the attention economy is about your eyeballs. Now it's hijacking your ears, and someone's in your ear all the time. It's either, oh, I'm listening to this podcast to maximize my longevity, but I'm stressed because I can't afford any of the products. I need a $20,000 like red light bed or whatever. And so I think people are the better coaches that are really skilled. They might taste a little of the data just to make sure they're on the right track, but it's sort of like the classic GPS driving. If you know where you're going, you don't need the GPS. Now you can say, well, Carl, what about if there's a crash down the road and 10 miles up, it's going to be some traffic, right? Agreed. But you don't need to be staring at the GPS screen the whole time. So I think what we're going to see is more embedded technology where it's sort of silent on the back burner. And what we're going to do is focus more on the human side. So I expect more science and more data, but it's really in the background. So expect that. And I do
And
think that, and I also think that people are going to get back to hills because there's something about achieving, when I do a hill, it might be the same amount of work if I'm doing resisted sprinting, but nothing feels good about being on the top of that small mountain and to look down and saying, okay, I'm connecting the dots. You'll get more out of your soul of doing some hills than looking at some sort of velocity decrement calculation. It's just no one cares.
we talked a lot about performance, enhancing performance, getting faster. What we didn't talk about was injuries. Where does that fit in? Like, have we made people more resilient? Have we created more overuse problems by loading their sprints, or trying to make them run faster than they're capable of running? What do you see there?
So there's two things I see: assisted and resisted. So let's go about resisted first.
Hmm.
Are resisted sprinting changing the NFL? Right? If we look at the the list of people that are gone for the IR, gone for the season, it looks like a Civil War monument. So while I was making fun of, socialism, you can point out that, hey, we didn't go through a civil war where, hundreds of thousands of people died. So when I look at that, I don't make a joke, oh, look at how many people are injured. It doesn't feel good when you see all those numbers because those are people, right? That means that person might be with a cane in 20 years or getting a surgery over and over again or addicted to pills. So when people start showing, oh, reducing injuries, take that really seriously because show me where it's happening in the league level. So I do think that it's not. I don't think that resisted sprinting, I think that training and getting better gives you a good chance. I'm not saying that that's not beneficial, but I'm seeing a lot of slop out there. And when I see resisted sprinting and I'm looking at that ankle, I'm looking at that Achilles and I'm thinking, not good, not good. And then you wonder why we're having so many problems with ruptures. If you're doing a lot of specific work and specific sprinting with load is specific. So, I can't do justice to Hank Krajinoff's voice because he's a Dutch guy. Um, but when you start seeing, regardless of how high tech resisted sprinting, it comes with baggage, right? There's an association that you're doing pattern overload, but now you're weighting it down. So that's kind of like the wearable resistance, with the Exogen, which is, there's some research that shows it's promising with like acceleration. There's a lot of good studies on it, but everything it has to be coached up. Now, the weirdest thing I've ever seen is the lack of really good information, and I've been trying to push this to the direction where everyone's familiar with Alter G's. It makes sense, right? Alter G, you unload yourself vertically, and you get to a return to play from that piece of equipment. Assisted horizontally, why is that so weird, right? We don't need to do overspeed to get value out of these machines. You can get assisted tempo, so people get a rhythm, people get an unloading, getting a little bit of a quote assistance. So I think that's where people need to do more assistance during the return to play and get back to tempo running and things that are less demanding than to use. Yeah, a lot of people will slow down because it doesn't cause the demand in terms of the neuromuscular demand of rehab with resisted sprinting. So I think that we have to do a better job on the assisted for rehab. And I think that we're also making a lot of problems worse with not only return to play with resistance, but GPP or off-season work. It's just simply not showing up. Now everyone's going to claim, "Oh, well, that's everyone else. That's not me." It's very difficult to prove with a mixed environment when you're not the entire person behind the scenes. Team sport, for example, college to pro. There's a lot of variables. So to me, I think there's an opportunity, but we're here and we still suffer from the same mistakes. And I see all this continuing education, and I'm like, yeah, I'm not buying it. This is very thin. You can tell it was on a Friday. Someone had to post a blog. None of the stuff I see is really leading. And there's a handful of experts that are doing a great job. Don't get me wrong, but the majority of the space does need some assistance. No pun intended.
Now, I'm big on like developing like percentages, proportions
Yeah.
for training. Would you, as a guideline, say you shouldn't do more than X percent of all your sprint volume under resistance or assistance? Would that be like I would say 10%, 15%? Like does that circulate in your brain in terms of if we're going to do this, we're going to do this in a way that I know I can get some sort of useful adaptation without creating the maladaptations.
Yeah, my parameters are pretty easy. I believe that 20% of my acceleration work should be resisted. And then you could resist every day by like 5%, right? Like you can come up with a way to say, okay, I'm just gonna just use 1 or 2 kilos, do that every day. You can go moderate loads on once a week. So how you distribute that, that's more art than science, and that's a lot of experimentation. But I just when I distribute risk, I have to go and usually use 3 to 6 major variables, so I'm not putting all my eggs into one basket. I think resisted sprinting is great. The question is, what's the distribution between hills? Uh, I favor hills. Now, I do like resistance on the track because it's reliable, it's precise, and you get a lot of data from it. So there's some values to horizontal resistance. But for me, I like a product of various modalities.
Diversify. Uh,
Diversified.
and we talked about people saying like, well, I don't have a hill. I live in the Midwest or
Mm,
wherever, the prairies in Canada, and we don't have a hill.
yeah.
And there are alternatives. Like I know at North Carolina, when I was helping Eric Hernandez, we found a parking garage. And if you know anything about the way they're designed, it's typically no more than a five, uh, I think a 5 degree or 8% grade, which is perfect. And usually they're somewhat used with corrugated concrete so people don't slip. So it's all designed around the American with Disabilities Act. So you know that you have some decent grades there. So yeah, I think there's ways to be creative to integrate resistance and assistance without going out of your way, without having to spend a lot of money, and also without having to put your athletes at risk.
Well, it's funny. I think for me, I really like it's not that I want to see suffering economically, but sometimes you see a parking garage that's near kind of a mall that's struggling, right? It's profitable, but it's not like, they're not putting a lot of resources into, monitoring the because like during lockdown, you know, sorry if that triggered you, but um, everything was about, okay, how do we train now? And all the facilities were closed. So you had all these high-tech training centers with millions of dollars behind the wall. Where did people go? They went to the parking garage. First of all you need is a rogue, uh, a bar and a some plates, and then yeah, you could run up the parking garage because that was a great slope. And then it's sometimes if it's covered, if you're on the not on the very top, you don't have to worry about rain, right? And then also if it's hot out, you have a little bit of protection. So, not that I'm going to be looking around for abandoned parking garages to create facilities, but that's kind of an interesting concept, that does work. So I think that's where, we are going to probably head back to seeing a lot more of those because once you know what's available with the science and practice, you know what's cosmetic, you know what's looking good but doesn't really add value. So I think that's where we're going to be going to.
Well, and there's something to be said for, I don't have a ready-made hill right beside me so we can just do it whenever we want to.
Yeah.
We have to go to that other park or that other facility, or we have to walk or spend time going to the parking garage. And that somehow, uh, that kind of limits exposure to some degree because now, well, we're not going to do that every day. Once a week, we're going to make that trek to that hill
Yeah.
and we're going to get our exposure and then we're going to get away from it. So I think having access isn't always a good thing.
Yeah, I think that's when, and there's also pressure. Hey, you built this or you bought this XYZ. Now you feel pressured to use it when like one of the best thing that I feel about is having all of this great access to technology and bringing it just to say, hey, it's there, so you can trust. If I don't use it, you can see that I'm not just saying because I don't have it. So having access to hills, having a great weight room, it shows nothing feels to an athlete better than saying, hey, this coach is deciding to do this because even though they have access to these other things, they're doing what's best for me. They're not trying to do it for social media. They're not trying to do it for politics to make sure that their boss, who's looking down at the athletic director's office, is say, "Hey, we spent all this money on this new flooring. How come they never use it or whatever?" So I
Yeah.
think that's where I think your point is. It's a moderation, which a lot of people don't like, is awesome. It's just like it's a really good, and that's why I think the 10% rule and all this stuff kind of became in vogue because usually rules and principles are written in blood. Something went wrong, something was epic failure. Like, hey, let's not do that again. And so, like for example, depth jumps. How many people in the 80s and 90s were going off 8 feet, right? And all these people were getting injured because, oh, we're doing depth jumps. It's like, so I think that's where we have to start learning, and I hopefully we have learned enough to evolve the space.
Great. Any final thoughts before we sign off here on what you want to see happen or
I
what?
think what I think people need to audit their programs and saying, what do I like to do? What do I need to do? And what am I willing to buy? A lot of people will buy stuff that they don't need or want, but because they're pressured to. A lot of people will do things that they like to do, but the athlete might not get a lot of value from. Okay. So I think the first thing with all of this stuff, slopes and sleds and all this stuff, really focus on what is essential that you believe in. And then if you're not doing that, change what you're doing in order to achieve that rather than, hey, I got to prove to everyone else that I'm sprint profiling. I need to go through and do this deceleration test. And I need to go through and get this measure. And I got to just tell the world that I have a dashboard of all this stuff that I'm thinking about. It takes courage to just trust yourself on the results. Because I've been there. I've been like, oh, I got to get this equipment. Otherwise, I'm going to be behind. But then you realize when you visit some of the best people in the world, it's like, you know what? It still comes down to great coaching.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not going to discourage anybody from buying and trying. And and you can go to a course and spend money, and you may go there and you go like, oh, that was kind of interesting. I don't know if I'll ever use it, but it does give you some perspective.
Yeah.
And you went out there and you did it. So I think I'm not going to fault anybody for buying a piece of equipment and trying it, and then finding out that they don't really use it that much, because that does happen. Like you said, with whether it's technology that I use, whether it's um, going to the hardware store and going, I really need that drill, right? And then you're like, no, I guess I didn't, right? But you still have it. So yeah, that's I think it's okay. We're all making that sort of trial and error method of figuring out what we need. So that's the best way to learn.
Great stuff. I appreciate leading the charge to getting back to our roots of what's necessary to get people better, rather than being caught up in the hype cycle. So
Yeah, and I hope if people have questions once they see this, that they kind of come forward and say like, well, what about this? And what about, if anything, this is just to create more discussion and dialogue around these topics because it just seems like it's going somewhere, but there's not a lot of guidance. So,
I think we've hit a point where I can sense it in the space where there's a little bit of malaise. There's a little bit of we're kind of stuck where there isn't really everyone's kind of it's very bland. And I think what's happened is we hit the critical mass has slowed down. That we need some leadership to get out of this what I consider a performance rut. It's like
yep.
everyone's speaking the same language, which is good, but I just don't see any type of traction on overcoming some of these problems. So, well, with that, thank you, and hopefully, what we'll see is, uh, we'll see also the companies that are making this start showing some true leadership about education that is more earnest and a little bit more authentic. So we
Hmm.
get away from the polish and the Hollywood montages and stuff like that. No, hopefully not Rocky. But like who knows? Maybe we see some motorized sprints for whatever the latest fight movie is going to be.
John Wick, yeah.
John Wick. But jokes aside, I think that'll be huge, and I won't get into the Tom Cruise sprinting stuff, but who maybe for his final Mission Impossible, he's going to be using that technology, and you're going to see him, hit 22 miles an hour or something like that. But so, all right,
Awesome. Thanks for
awesome,
your time, Carl.
no problem. Thank you.